The corpse that no one could identify. Inspector Purbright, BBC Crime Audio. The morning mist clung to the railway embankment like damp cotton wool, thick enough to blur the outlines of the houses on the far side of the tracks. From somewhere in the haze came the muted clatter of a milk cart and the soft, rhythmic clinking of bottles. Young Peter Clues, who had been trusted for the first time to complete his round alone, whistled nervously as he walked. He very nearly missed the body. At first glance, the pale shape lying partly in the grass seemed only a discarded sack. It was only when Peter saw a hand, clean, oddly waxy, resting palm upward on the frosted grass that he dropped his crate of bottles, sending a cascade of tinkling glass into the mist. Peter bolted. By the time Sergeant Mallet and Constable Allgood arrived, Peter's story had grown considerably. According to him, the dead man had one staring eye open, a knife in his chest, and a note pinned to his coat bearing mysterious foreign writing. In reality, none of these embellishments proved true, but Mallet found the scene disturbing enough without them. The body lay on its back, perfectly straight, as if carefully placed rather than dropped. The man's clothing was nondescript but oddly formal, a neat dark suit with no labels, a white shirt of fine quality, and a pair of highly polished shoes. These shoes curiously bore no trace of mud, though the surrounding ground was a churned mess of wet soil and trampled grass. Could have been carried, muttered Mallet, peering down. But why here? Why like this? Constable Allgood, who had never seen a dead body before, shifted uncomfortably. Looks like he might have just lain down for a nap and never got up, sir, Mallet grunted. Yet people don't lie down for a nap by the railway embankment. Not dressed like that. The coroner, Dr. Dabb, arrived not long after, yawning into a handkerchief. He bent over the body, muttered a few observations about rigor mortis, and finally said, "No obvious cause of death. Heart failure, perhaps. Or poison, or sheer boredom. Hard to say until I've had him on my table." The doctor's casual tone did little to comfort Mallet. When Inspector Purbright arrived, he paused for a moment at the edge of the mist. His mild, round face gave little away as he surveyed the scene. He removed his bowler hat, ran a hand over his thinning hair, and replaced it carefully before speaking. "Good morning, Sergeant. I understand we have acquired a puzzle." "That we have, sir," said Mallet, relieved to pass responsibility upward. "No identification on him? Pockets empty but for a handkerchief and some change. No wallet, no papers? Not even a train ticket?" Purbright crouched beside the body, studying the neat shoes, the immaculate cuffs, the peculiar lack of mud. He said nothing for a long moment. Finally, he murmured, "Curious, very curious indeed." The inspector's gaze shifted to the railway tracks, then to the faint outline of Flaxborough's station roof in the distance. "Sergeant," he said at last, "have someone speak with the station staff. Quietly, if you please. Let us not have the whole town in a lather before we know what we are dealing with." Mallet nodded, though he suspected the town was already very much in a lather. Even as he turned to give instructions, the mist was lifting, and with it, the first tendrils of gossip that would soon coil through every shop, pub and parlour in Flaxborough. As the body was carried away, Purbright lingered, his eyes narrowing slightly. Something about the scene troubled him, though he could not yet have said what. It was not merely the lack of identification, it was the placement, deliberate, intentional, almost theatrical. He straightened, his expression once again bland and mild. "Come along, Sergeant," he said. "I imagine we have a great many people to disappoint today." The mist had fully dissolved by the time they reached the station, revealing a bright, deceptively ordinary morning. Flaxborough was awake, and Flaxborough was talking. By mid-morning, the story of the mysterious body had spread through Flaxborough with the efficiency of smoke escaping a keyhole. The first whisper had risen, predictably enough from the post office queue, where Mrs. Gillingworth, having overheard a portion of Sergeant Mallet's hurried conversation with Constable Allgood, passed on what she knew or thought she knew to her most attentive customer, Mrs. Copplestone. From there it travelled to the Grapes Inn, where pints of mild and well-aimed conjecture flowed freely. By the time a delivery boy mentioned it to the butcher's wife, the dead man had acquired a whole portfolio of improbable characteristics, foreign certainly, wealthy beyond doubt, and involved in espionage, smuggling, or possibly both. Mrs. Gillingworth, flustered by how quickly her fragmentary tale had bloomed into a jungle of speculation, tried to correct the more outlandish claims but quickly gave up. Her own account, relayed with a sniff of propriety, was that the deceased was likely a businessman from a neighbouring town who had been set upon by thieves. She delivered this with such certainty that listeners nodded gravely, though no one entirely believed her. Across the square, the ironmonger Mr. Digby leaned heavily on his counter and shook his head at the fuss. "Mark my words," he declared to a knot of customers. "It'll turn out to be nothing more than a tramp who strayed where he shouldn't. Inspector Purbright'll have it wrapped up before Sunday." This view did not satisfy Mrs. Tumbrel, who had been lurking near the hardware section for the better part of an hour, listening intently. "Oh, I wouldn't be so sure, Mr. Digby," she said, lowering her voice in a manner that forced everyone else to lean closer. "I heard from my cousin's neighbour that there were strange marks on the poor man's body. Symbols like cultish things." The group shivered with delighted horror. Meanwhile, Councillor Daggett, flushed with self-importance and a breakfast of kippers, was telling anyone who would listen that the matter should be treated as a municipal emergency. Visitors to our fair town must feel secure. He bellowed at a hastily convened gathering outside the town hall. If a body can appear out of nowhere, why think of the impact on tourism? His speech was punctuated by sighs from Dr. Dabb, who had been dragged from his surgery to attend. The doctor muttered darkly about misplaced priorities, noting that the real issue was the distress caused to the boy who found the corpse. "And to me," he added with a touch of self-pity, "dead bodies are terribly inconvenient before one's second cup of tea." At the bookshop, Mr. Bristow displayed his usual air of amused detachment, his long fingers arranging volumes of detective fiction with care. When a young woman burst in, breathlessly demanding the latest installment of The Yard Investigates, he raised an eyebrow. "You'll be pleased to know," he said smoothly, "that today's events provide far better material than anything in print. A body with no name. Quite thrilling, don't you think? Though I suspect our local gossips will embellish it beyond recognition by tea time." The young woman nodded eagerly. "Do you think it's murder, Mr. Bristow?" "Ah," he replied with a faint smile, "that depends on one's definition of murder. Some would say a man can be killed just as thoroughly by silence as by a blade." By noon, the market square itself had become a stage for competing narratives. Fishmongers hawked their wares over the rising din of conversation, while housewives paused mid-purchase to exchange the latest tidbit. A visiting salesman unfamiliar with Flaxborough's rhythms mistook the excitement for some sort of festival and attempted to sell commemorative tea towels. Through it all, Purbright moved quietly, observing without drawing notice. His mild expression gave no hint of his thoughts as he drifted between stalls, occasionally exchanging pleasantries but never volunteering information. Where others saw a flurry of disconnected gossip, he noted patterns: who spoke too quickly, who avoided eye contact, who offered details that could only have come from first-hand knowledge. He stopped briefly at the baker's, where Mrs. Copplestone was breathlessly relating the story of how the deceased had been found with a dagger in his chest and a map in his pocket. Purbright listened politely, thanked her for the buns she pressed upon him, and left without correcting a single falsehood. Outside he encountered Sergeant Mallet, who looked harried and red-faced. "It's spreading like wildfire, sir," Mallet complained. "We'll have half the county descending on us by nightfall if this keeps up." "That may not be entirely undesirable," Purbright said mildly. "Sometimes a blaze illuminates corners one might otherwise miss." Mallet blinked at him, puzzled, but held his tongue. He had long since learned that Purbright's remarks often made sense only after events had unfolded. As the church bells tolled the hour, a hush fell briefly over the square. For that single moment, Flaxborough seemed to hold its breath, caught between curiosity and unease. Then the clamour resumed, louder than before, as though the very air demanded more speculation. Purbright watched the faces around him, each animated by excitement, fear, or self-importance. Somewhere among them, he felt certain, was someone who knew far more than they were saying. He turned away, his expression as bland as a baker's roll. The investigation, he reflected, was no longer merely about identifying a body. It was about untangling a web of human stories, each thread bright with deceit and desire, and Flaxborough, as ever, provided no shortage of those. Inspector Purbright preferred to begin an investigation with a stroll. It gave the impression of casualness and afforded him time to let the scattered facts of a case settle naturally, like silt in a jar of river water. By mid-afternoon, with the market square still humming like a disturbed beehive, he set off toward the railway station. The station master, Mr. Fenwick, was a wiry man whose expression hovered perpetually between mild irritation and outright indignation, as though his entire career had been one long affront. He greeted Purbright with a curt nod and an audible sniff. "Inspector," he said, clutching a clipboard like a weapon.
"I suppose you hear about this."
"Unfortunate matter."
"Terrible business, terrible!" Purbright's mild smile did not change.
"Indeed, Mr. Fenwick. I thought it best to trouble you for a few minutes."
"Purely routine." "Routine," Fenwick repeated with heavy irony.
"Nothing routine about dead bodies turning up near my station, I assure you. Makes us look very bad to the travelling public." Purbright tilted his head slightly. "I imagine so. Still, if we might focus on practicalities, were there any unusual passengers on the early trains this morning? Someone you did not recognize, perhaps?" Fenwick's lips pursed. "Inspector, I pride myself on knowing nearly every face that passes through here, and I can tell you with complete confidence that no such person crossed this platform today, or yesterday. No strangers at all." Purbright's tone was politely surprised. "Not a one. Except for the milk train delivery man, of course, but he hardly counts. As for the others, businessmen, schoolchildren, Mrs. Peebles off to visit her sister in Dunmow."
"Regulars, everyone," Purbright nodded as though this were entirely expected.
"And yet," he said softly, "a man managed to appear near the embankment without a single witness to his arrival."
"Curious, don't you think?"
Fenwick shifted uncomfortably. "Well, perhaps he came by road, perhaps." Purbright let the word hang for a moment before adding, "No one asked you in passing about luggage or directions? No inquiries that struck you as odd?" The station master hesitated. A flicker of something, nervousness perhaps, crossed his face. Then it was gone. "No," he said firmly. "Nothing at all." Purbright gave a small bow of acknowledgement. "Thank you, Mr. Fenwick. Your assistance is greatly appreciated." Outside, Sergeant Mallet was waiting beside the police car.
"Anything useful, sir?"
he asked, hopefully. "Only confirmation," Purbright replied, his eyes half-lidded. "Sometimes absence speaks louder than presence." They drove a short distance to the bus depot, where the afternoon lull had left only a few vehicles parked neatly in a row. Inside, the air smelled of oil, wet coats, and the faint tang of tobacco. The depot manager directed them to George Lim, a veteran driver with a broad face and a permanently harassed expression. "Morning, Inspector," Lim said, tugging at his cap. "Well, it was morning when I started this shift anyhow." "Mr. Lim," Purbright began gently, "I wonder if you might recall any unusual passengers recently. In particular, a man travelling alone, middle-aged, neatly dressed." Lim scratched his chin. "Middle-aged, neat clothes. Doesn't narrow it much, sir. We get plenty of those."
"Any idea where he might have boarded?"
"That," Purbright said, "is part of the puzzle." The driver thought for a moment. "Yesterday evening there was a chap who kept to himself. Sat right at the back, didn't say a word. Couldn't tell you where he got off, though. Half the bus emptied at the stop near the station." Did you notice anything distinctive about him? Lim frowned. Funny thing, now you mention it, his shoes were spotless. Everyone else had mud on their boots. Been raining, see? But his was shiny as a new penny, like he'd just stepped out of a shop window. Purbright's gaze sharpened, though his voice remained mild. How interesting.
Anything else?
Well, he kept his hands in his pockets the whole ride. Never saw him fidget or glance around like most folks do. Just sat there stiff as a board. Gave me the shivers, if I'm honest. Purbright thanked him and made a note in his small leather book. As they turned to leave, Lim added, almost reluctantly, "Look, Inspector, I've been driving this route 15 years.
Folks come and go, but this fellow, I swear I've never seen him before in my life," Mallet muttered as they left the depot.
That's 2 people now claiming they've seen no strangers, sir. Either the whole town's blind or, Purbright said softly, they've chosen to forget. Their final visit of the afternoon was to the vicarage. The Reverend Mr. Pelham received them in a sitting room that smelled of damp hymn books and old lavender. He was a thin, nervous man whose spectacles seemed perpetually about to slide off his nose. "Inspector, Sergeant," he said, fluttering his hands.
"I heard about the
discovery. Quite dreadful. I've been praying for the poor soul." Purbright inclined his head. "We appreciate that, Reverend."
I wondered whether you might recognize the description of the deceased."
Middle-aged, tidy appearance, dark suit, white shirt. Pelham bit his lip.
"I can't say that I do."
"No parishioner of mine, certainly. And I make it my duty to know everyone in this community." "Of course." Purbright's tone was understanding. Yet sometimes a visitor attends a service quietly without drawing notice. You might not recall immediately. The vicar hesitated, his fingers tightening on the arm of his chair. "Well, there was a gentleman at evensong last week. Sat alone at the back. I assumed he was merely passing through. Can you describe him?" "Only vaguely. He wore gloves the entire time, which I thought peculiar indoors. And when the collection plate came round, he placed nothing on it, just gave a small nod, as though acknowledging some private arrangement." "Did he speak to anyone afterward?"
"No, Inspector."
"He left before the final hymn ended." Purbright studied Pelham's face for a moment. "You are certain no one else spoke to him?"
"No word, no gesture?"
The vicar swallowed. "Not that I observed." There was a pause, during which the ticking of the vicarage clock seemed unusually loud. Then Purbright smiled gently and rose.
"Thank you, Reverend."
"You have been most helpful." As they walked back toward the car, Mallet glanced at his superior. "Funny, isn't it, sir? 3 different people, 3 different settings, and still no one claims to know the man. You'd think he was a ghost." Purbright slipped his notebook into his pocket. "Ghosts, Sergeant, do not wear immaculate shoes." Mallet gave a short laugh, but the inspector's expression remained thoughtful. Somewhere beneath the polite denials and selective memories, he sensed recognition. Someone, somewhere, had looked into that man's face before he died, and chosen to say nothing. The question was not merely who the dead man was, but why the living was so determined to erase him. The break in the case, if it could be called that, arrived just before sunset, borne on the breathless urgency of Constable Allgood. He came stumbling into Purbright's office, cap askew, and blurted out that a man had been seen near the embankment on the night before the body was found. "Mrs. Penstow swears to it, sir," Allgood said, puffing.
"Says she saw him through her parlour curtains, heading toward the railway at about 9:30.
"Shabby-looking fellow," she says, and carrying a bundle under his arm. "She's quite certain he didn't belong around here." Purbright, seated at his desk with his fingers steepled, listened without visible reaction. After a moment he asked, "Did Mrs. Penstow happen to mention why she was looking out of her parlour window at 9:30? Allgood blinked.
"Said she was checking on her cat, sir."
"It had gone missing." "Ah." Purbright's tone gave nothing away.
"And the man's features, did she describe them in detail?"
"Well," Allgood admitted, "not exactly, sir. Just that he had a bit of stubble and, a guilty look about him, as she put it." Purbright allowed a faint sigh to escape. "Very well. Please inform Sergeant Mallet that I should like a word with this mysterious figure, should he be located." As if on cue, Mallet himself appeared an hour later, triumph etched on his ruddy face. "Got him, sir."
Name's Arthur Goff. Bit of a drifter. Stays in the old barn behind Kettleby's farm when he's not working odd jobs.
He's got a record too. Couple of thefts, minor scuffles. Nothing serious, but enough to show his character, eh?
And where did you find him?
Purbright asked mildly. At the Grapes, nursing a pint like he hadn't a care in the world. Tried to make a run for it when we approached, which tells you something, doesn't it? Purbright did not answer directly. Instead, he rose and retrieved his coat. Let us hear what Mr. Goff has to say. The man they brought in was thin, with a face lined by weather and suspicion. He sat hunched on the hard wooden chair, hands clasped tightly together, eyes darting from Purbright to Mallet and back again. "You've no right dragging me in here," he muttered. "I've done nothing wrong." "No one is accusing you of wrongdoing," Purbright said pleasantly. "We merely wish to clarify your movements last evening."
You were seen near the railway embankment. That's a lie, Goff snapped. I never went near the tracks.
"I was at the Grapes most of the night."
Ask anyone, Mallet folded his arms.
"Mrs. Penstow's word is good enough for me. She's known in this town," Goff gave a bitter laugh. "Known for sticking her nose where it doesn't belong, more like. Look, I might have been walking the lane, sure, but only to fetch firewood. That's no crime." Purbright studied him for a long moment.
And the bundle you carried?
The man hesitated, then said, "Old clothes."
I was taking them to patch up my coat. May we see them? I burned them, Goff said quickly.
They were useless. Mallet shot Purbright a triumphant look. The inspector, however, merely inclined his head. "Very well, Mr. Goff. You will, of course, understand that we must verify your account. Until then, Sergeant Mallet will arrange for you to remain in our care." As Goff was led away, protesting loudly, Purbright's expression remained unreadable. The next morning brought a visit from Councillor Daggett and 2 other members of the town council,
all radiating an air of civic urgency.
Daggett, red-faced and sweating despite the cool weather, wasted no time in stating his purpose. "Inspector, we've heard you have a suspect in custody. This is excellent news. The whole town is on edge, and frankly, our reputation is at stake. Businesses are already grumbling about lost custom." "I see," Purbright said politely. Daggett leaned forward. "So you'll be announcing the arrest soon? Perhaps at tonight's council meeting. A prompt resolution will do wonders for public confidence." Purbright's mild gaze moved from Daggett to the others. "It is true that Mr. Goff is being questioned. However, I must caution against premature conclusions. At present, we have only one witness statement, and that, as you may know, is somewhat vague." The second councillor, a tall, cadaverous man named Sims, interjected sharply. "Vague or not, it is sufficient. The people demand action, Inspector." "Better a flawed answer than none at all." Purbright's eyebrows rose slightly. "An interesting philosophy, Mr. Sims, though I confess I have always preferred accuracy to haste." Daggett cleared his throat. "We are not here to interfere with your methods, Inspector.
Merely to impress upon you the
necessity of discretion. The longer this affair drags on, the more likely it is that rumours will spiral out of control. For everyone's sake, it would be best to close the matter quickly." There was a brief silence. Purbright appeared to consider their words with deep gravity. At last he said, "I understand your concern. You may rest assured that I shall do everything within my power to bring the investigation to a swift and satisfactory conclusion." The councillors departed looking somewhat appeased, though Sims muttered darkly as they went. When the door closed, Mallet exhaled noisily.
I thought you were going to tell them off proper, sir.
"You don't believe Goff did it, do you?" Purbright turned to his sergeant with a faint smile. "Belief, Sergeant, is a luxury we cannot afford. We shall continue to gather facts. In the meantime, let us allow certain parties to think they have achieved their desired outcome. It often encourages them to relax, and in relaxation, people reveal themselves." Mallet frowned. "So we keep Goff locked up?" "For now," Purbright said softly, "though I suspect he is as much a victim of circumstance as anyone." He moved to the window, gazing out at the quiet street beyond. Somewhere in this tidy town, a far more calculating mind was at work, content to let a convenient scapegoat bear the weight of its crime, and Purbright, with his unhurried manner and unreadable eyes, intended to flush it into the open. The following morning a thin drizzle hung over Flaxborough, softening the outlines of hedges and rooftops and lending the town a muted, almost dreamlike quality. Inspector Purbright, wrapped in his raincoat and carrying a small black umbrella, returned alone to the railway embankment. There was no urgency in his step, no outward sign that the previous day's developments weighed on him, though they most certainly did. Arthur Goff was still in custody, grumbling loudly enough to be heard by half the station house. The councillors were satisfied for the moment, convinced the matter would soon be tied up neatly. And yet, in Purbright's mind, the pieces of the puzzle lay scattered and ill-fitting. Goffey's arrest, far from providing clarity, had only sharpened the sense that someone was pushing events toward a comfortable but false conclusion. The scene by the embankment looked different, without the mist that had cloaked it on the morning the body was found. The grass was dull and wet, flattened where boots had trampled it, and the hedgerow on either side of the footpath sagged under the weight of the rain. A few pieces of string marked where the corpse had lain. Purbright stood very still, umbrella tilted back, and allowed his eyes to drift over the area with a detached, almost idle gaze. He preferred to see a place as it was when no one expected him to be looking.
Often, the smallest inconsistencies revealed themselves only when they were no longer guarded. He crouched near the edge of the path, brushing aside a tangle of damp leaves with his gloved hand.
Nothing remarkable met his eye at first. Scraps of paper, a broken matchstick, a crushed beer bottle cap. Ordinary litter, as might be found along any rural track. Then, just beneath the outermost hedge, he saw a faint glimmer of pale blue. It might easily have been overlooked. A corner of something thin and folded, caught between two thorny branches. With careful fingers, Purbright teased it free. It was a bus ticket, sodden but still legible. The print showed the date, yesterday, and the issuing point, Kettleby's Lane, the stop on the far edge of town. The time was stamped clearly, 9:40 p.m. Purbright stared at it for a long moment,
rain dripping from the brim of his hat, according to Mrs. Penstow's statement.
Arthur Goff had been seen walking toward the railway embankment around 9:30. If that were true, and if he had arrived by foot as she claimed, then why would a ticket from a bus line ending at Kettleby's Lane be lying here, barely concealed beneath the hedge? He turned the ticket over, examining the back. There was nothing distinctive about it, nothing to indicate ownership. It could have been dropped by anyone, or placed deliberately. Purbright's thoughts moved with quiet precision. If the deceased had indeed arrived by bus at that time, it suggested he had reached the area alive and unaccompanied. But if so, why had no one seen him disembark? And why had the station master and bus driver both professed ignorance with such emphatic certainty? More troubling still was the possibility that the ticket had been left here later,
as a prop, a piece of evidence not lost by accident,
but planted to support a particular story. He slipped the ticket into his notebook and closed it carefully. The sound of boots squelching through wet grass drew his attention. Sergeant Mallet appeared, breath visible in the chill air, looking put upon and damp. "Sir, I thought I'd find you here." Mallet glanced around with visible discomfort.
Doesn't seem so mysterious in daylight, does it?
Just a miserable bit of mud and bushes. Appearances are often deceptive, Sergeant, Purbright murmured. Mallet wiped his brow.
Council's been on the telephone again. Councillor Daggett in particular wants to know when we'll charge Goff proper.
Says the town won't stand for dithering. Purbright's smile was mild and untroubled. Please convey my appreciation to Councillor Daggett for his keen interest. Tell him we are pursuing every avenue, Mallet grunted.
I'll tell him that.
But between you and me, sir, this doesn't sit right. That fellow Goff might be rough around the edges, but he doesn't strike me as a killer. Purbright's eyes flicked briefly toward the hedge where the bus ticket had been lodged. "Indeed, Sergeant. Appearances again. You've got a feeling about this, haven't you, sir?" Mallet asked, narrowing his eyes. Purbright adjusted his umbrella.
Let us simply say I am curious. I dislike questions that are too neatly answered. The sergeant shifted uneasily, glancing back toward the road.
"Do you think Mrs. Penstow might have been mistaken? Maybe the fellow she saw wasn't Gough at all." "Perhaps," Purbright said non-committally. "Or perhaps she saw exactly what she was meant to see." They walked together back toward the car. Purbright's steps were unhurried, his expression as bland as a man contemplating his next cup of tea. Yet inside his mind was turning rapidly. The ticket was a small thing, easy to dismiss, a mere scrap of paper. But to Purbright it was more than that. It was a thread dangling from the hem of an elaborate garment, and he intended to see how far it unravelled. As they reached the roadside, Mallet said, "Shall I bag up the rubbish here, sir? Just in case." "That won't be necessary," Purbright replied smoothly. "We mustn't overburden ourselves with clutter. Only what is truly relevant should be preserved." Mallet accepted this without question, failing to notice how carefully the inspector's hand remained on his closed notebook. As the car rumbled back toward town, Purbright sat in silence, watching the rain trace slow lines across the window glass. The councillors wanted certainty, the townsfolk wanted a story, and the evidence was being shaped to oblige them. But the dead man, mute and stubborn, refused to fit the narrative so neatly prepared for him. Purbright's fingers brushed the outline of the ticket in his pocket. He would not reveal it, not yet. Not until the right moment, when its significance could not be ignored, and when the person who had so carefully placed it here would be forced to explain why. The drizzle of the previous day had given way to a brisk, bright morning, the kind of weather that made the market square look deceptively cheerful. Stalls gleamed with polished apples, bolts of fabric fluttered in the breeze, and the ever-present hum of gossip floated over the clatter of carts. Yet beneath this lively surface, the undercurrent of unease remained. A stranger had died, and until someone respectable was found to shoulder the blame, every glance lingered a fraction too long, every conversation turned quickly away when a uniform appeared. Inspector Purbright, strolling among the stalls with his usual mild expression, noted these tiny shifts with care. It was not the loud proclamations that interested him, but the awkward silences, the sudden tightening of a mouth, or the glance cast over a shoulder before speaking. Today, several new elements had entered the pattern, and each promised to complicate matters further. The first came in the form of Mr. Edgar Prawle, a travelling salesman whose stock in trade seemed to be both haberdashery and hyperbole. He was a round man with a shining forehead and a moustache so thin it resembled a pencil mark. Spying Purbright near the greengrocer's, he swooped down like a hawk that had spotted an unsuspecting mouse. "Inspector, just the man I was hoping to see." Prawle's voice carried alarmingly across the square, turning several heads. "I have information of a most sensational nature regarding your
situation." He lowered his voice only fractionally, which had the effect of making everyone nearby strain to listen. Purbright inclined his head.
"Indeed, Mr. Prawle. I am always eager to be enlightened." "Well," Prawle said, drawing himself up, "last evening, as I was leaving the Red Lion after a modest refreshment, purely medicinal, mind you, I observed a figure lurking near the alley behind Mr. Bristow's bookshop. Very suspicious behaviour, Inspector. He was carrying something long and thin, wrapped in brown paper."
"Could have been a rifle for all I know."
Purbright's expression did not change.
"And this was at what time?" 10:30 precisely.
"My watch is Swiss, very reliable. Now, I didn't get a good look at the fellow's face, but he was wearing a hat. Felt hat, common sort. Did he notice you?" "Oh, I was too discreet for that, Inspector," Prawle said proudly. "You might say I have a natural talent for observation. Of course, When I later heard of the body by the railway, I immediately thought the two events must be connected. It is only logical. Only logical, Purbright echoed, his tone politely neutral. You are most public-spirited, Mr. Prawl. If you should recall any further detail, perhaps about the man's build or manner, you will let me know at once. Prawl puffed up like a pigeon accepting crumbs. You may rely upon me, Inspector. As he bustled away, clearly intending to broadcast his contribution to anyone who would listen, Purbright allowed himself a small inward sigh. The man's story had been rich in embroidery but poor in substance. Still, even exaggerated accounts sometimes contained a sliver of truth. Leaving the square, Purbright made his way to a narrow lane at the edge of town, where a small cottage sat half-hidden behind an overgrown hedge. The widow who lived there, Mrs. Hartleby, had sent word through a mutual acquaintance that she wished to speak, but only privately. She answered the door with a nervous flutter of hands, her eyes darting past Purbright to ensure no one had followed him. "Inspector, I shouldn't be involved at all," she whispered, ushering him inside. "But I can't bear the thought of that poor man lying in the morgue with no name. It's dreadful." Purbright accepted a seat by the cold fireplace. "Whatever you tell me will remain confidential unless there is genuine cause for concern." Mrs. Hartleby wrung her handkerchief. "Well, it's just... A few nights ago I heard voices near the back garden."
Low voices arguing. I couldn't make out the words, but one of them, "Oh, Inspector, it sounded like someone crying." "A man, could you see them?"
Purbright asked gently. No, it was too dark. "And I didn't dare go out." She glanced toward the window, as though expecting to see someone listening even now. "The next morning, there was a patch of trampled grass by the fence, and, I told myself it was nothing. But then I heard about the body." "Did you recognize either of the voices?"
Her lips trembled. "That's why I'm frightened. I think
one of them might have been Mr. Sims, the counsellor. But please don't tell him I said so."
He has influence and I'm just a widow. I can't afford enemies." Purbright promised nothing, merely thanking her with grave courtesy before taking his leave.
As he walked back toward the centre of town, his mind turned over this new piece of information. If true, it introduced an entirely different angle, one that would not be welcomed by the council. His next stop was the office of Mr. Foyle, a solicitor whose reputation for circumspection was legendary. Foyle received him with polite froideur, offering tea but no warmth. "Inspector," he said, seating himself behind a desk that seemed deliberately to separate them. "I trust this is a brief visit. I have clients waiting. I shall endeavour to be succinct," Purbright replied. "It has come to my attention that certain financial documents relating to the deceased may have passed through your office."
"I am merely seeking clarification." Foyle's expression became shuttered.
"I am bound by client confidentiality, Inspector."
"I cannot discuss such matters, not even in connection with a death under investigation."
"Especially not then." The solicitor's tone was cool and final. Purbright regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "I see. I would not wish to inconvenience you further, Mr. Foyle. Thank you for your time." As he left, he noticed a ledger hastily closed on the desk, its edge marked with a smear of damp soil. A small thing, easily missed. Back in the market square, tension was brewing in public view. Councillor Daggett stood on the steps of the town hall, red-faced and shouting, while Mr. Bristow, the bookshop owner, replied in low, cutting tones that carried farther than Daggett's bluster. A crowd had gathered, enjoying the spectacle. "You accuse me of harbouring criminals, sir," Bristow said icily, "when it is your own council's negligence that allowed this tragedy to occur."
"Negligence," Daggett thundered. "I'll not be slandered by a peddler of second-hand books."
The argument spiralled, dredging up years-old grievances about property taxes and library funding. Purbright, arriving at the edge of the crowd, watched carefully. Amid the drama, he noted a subtle exchange, a young clerk passing Daggett a folded note, which the councillor pocketed without breaking stride. When the confrontation ended, Daggett stormed away, while Bristow vanished into his shop with a look of cold satisfaction. Mallet appeared at Purbright's side, looking bewildered. "Seems like everyone's at each other's throats, sir. Doesn't feel much like a murder case anymore, more like a village brawl." Purbright's eyes followed the departing figures.
On the contrary, Sergeant, it feels very much like a murder case.
"A great many people are trying very hard to misdirect us, which suggests we are drawing closer to the truth." He patted his notebook, where the damp bus ticket lay hidden. "The difficulty lies not in finding suspects, but in discerning which of them has something worth hiding, and what lengths they will go to in order to keep it hidden." The morning began with an acrid smell drifting across the town, sharp enough to rouse even the late sleepers and set tongues wagging before breakfast. By the time Purbright arrived at the railway yard, a huddle of townsfolk had already gathered at the perimeter fence, their faces pale with excitement and soot-streaked light from the lingering smoke. The goods shed, a long timbered structure that had stood for decades, was now a blackened ruin. Steam rose from the smouldering beams where the fire brigade's hoses had left puddles of dirty water, and the air carried a bitter tang of scorched paper. Sergeant Mallet met Purbright at the gate, his uniform damp and his temper frayed. "Started just after dawn, sir. Watchman says he smelled smoke, but by the time he got here, the place was well alight. Went up like kindling." Purbright's gaze swept the charred remains.
Any injuries?
"None, thank heavens," Mallet said. "But half the contents are gone. Records, receipts, manifests, everything that might have told us what was stored here last night." He paused, lowering his voice. "Including the passenger ledgers from last week." Purbright said nothing for a moment. His expression remained mild, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he stepped over the threshold of the ruined doorway. The floor was littered with blackened fragments, the remains of crates and twisted metal hinges. Near the back wall, where the fire had burned hottest, lay a heap of paper reduced to ash. The inspector crouched and examined the charred debris. "Curious, isn't it?" he murmured. "How a fire knows precisely which corner to consume." Mallet frowned.
You think it wasn't an accident?
Purbright straightened, brushing soot from his gloves. "Fires are rarely so obliging as to confine themselves neatly to sensitive documents, Sergeant. A coincidence, perhaps?"
But I do not place much faith in coincidence. The crowd outside had grown thicker, and their murmurs carried to where the two men stood.
Bits of conversation drifted on the damp air, snatches of accusation, fear, and wild conjecture.
Someone said it, mark my words. Outsiders again, no respect for the town. All very convenient, don't you think?
First a body, now this. Purbright stepped back out into the open, the better to observe them. The faces were animated, some flushed with anger, others pinched with worry. Several looked toward him expectantly as though he might announce a culprit on the spot. Instead, he inclined his head gravely and said nothing, which seemed to unsettle them more than any speech might have done. A man elbowed his way to the front, Mr. Prawl, the travelling salesman, his moustache drooping dramatically.
Inspector, I saw a stranger last night skulking near the yard.
Thin fellow with a limp, I was just telling the others. He had the look of a foreigner about him. Suspicious character if ever there was one. Before Purbright could respond, Councillor Daggett arrived, red-faced and puffing like a steam engine.
This is intolerable,
he roared, gesturing at the ruin. First a body, now arson. The town's reputation is being dragged through the mud. We must take decisive action at once. Purbright regarded him mildly. Decisive action of what sort, Councillor?
Curfews, Daggett snapped.
Increase patrols. Question every itinerant and vagrant within a 10-mile radius.
I'll not have Flaxborough made a laughingstock. Mallet shifted uncomfortably.
We've already got Goff locked up, sir. Then find his friends, Daggett barked. There's always a gang behind this sort of thing. From the crowd came mutters of agreement and dissent in equal measure.
A stout woman shouted, "It's a cover-up! They're hiding the truth, same as with that body."
Others took up the cry, and soon the air was thick with accusations. some directed at the council, others at the railway company, and a few boldly, if illogically, at the fire brigade. Purbright let the noise rise unchecked until it reached a near hysterical pitch. Then he raised a hand, palm outward, and spoke in a calm, measured voice that somehow carried over the hubbub. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, until we have evidence, speculation will serve no one." The crowd subsided, though not entirely. Daggett seized the moment to thrust himself forward again.
Evidence! Inspector, the evidence is right there.
He jabbed a finger toward the smouldering ruin. Someone set this fire deliberately to destroy records that might have identified that body. "You cannot deny it." "I deny nothing," Purbright said smoothly. "But neither do I affirm without proof. The difficulty, Councillor, is that the proof itself may now lie in ashes." Daggett spluttered, clearly unused to having his righteous certainty met with such mildness.
"Then by heaven, find me some proof."
"The town demands it." Purbright inclined his head slightly. "We shall endeavour to do so." As Daggett stormed away, muttering about summoning a special council session, Purbright turned to Mallet. "Sergeant, kindly have a word with the watchman again. I should like to know precisely where he was standing when he first smelled smoke, and whether anyone passed him on the road." "Yes, sir," Mallet said, though doubt tinged his voice.
"But you think he's hiding something?"
"I think," Purbright replied, "that he may have noticed something he does not yet realize was significant." While Mallet went to carry out his task, Purbright walked slowly around the perimeter of the shed. His gaze skimmed over the ground, noting the patterns of water and soot, the direction of the char marks, the way certain boards had burned through while others remained almost untouched. Near the back, where a broken window hung limply from its frame, he paused. Beneath the sill lay a small heap of cinders, and within them a fragment of cloth, stiffened by heat, its original colour indistinct. He stooped, examined it, and tucked it carefully into his notebook. By mid-morning, news of the fire had spread beyond the yard. In the tea shops and public houses, theories multiplied with astonishing speed. Some claimed the fire had been set by railway men to cover their own incompetence. Others insisted it was the work of outsiders bent on sabotaging the town. A particularly inventive group at the Grapes Inn suggested that the body and the fire were connected by a secret government project, though none could agree on what the project might be. Even Mrs. Gillingworth at the post office, normally a bastion of respectable moderation, whispered darkly to a customer about shadowy figures in government vans seen near the goods yard after midnight. Purbright, returning to his office, found a note waiting on his desk. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "Inspector, please come to the vicarage as soon as possible. There is something you ought to know. It concerns last night." He folded the note without comment. Mallet appeared a moment later, wiping his hands on a rag. "Watchman swears he didn't see a soul, sir. Says the fire must have started inside near the back wall." Purbright tapped the folded note thoughtfully against his palm.
"Inside near the back wall," he repeated.
"Exactly where the records were kept," Mallet nodded grimly. "Looks like someone knew what they were doing." Purbright moved to the window and gazed out at the town, where smoke still lingered above the rooftops like a smudge on a painting. "Indeed, Sergeant. And now it seems they would have us believe that our task is hopeless. But destruction, however thorough, often leaves behind its own peculiar traces." He slipped the charred cloth fragment onto his desk, its edges crumbling slightly. "We must be patient. The truth, like fire, has a way of spreading, no matter how carefully someone tries to smother it." Outside, a church bell began to toll, the sound solemn and unsettling. The town's heartbeat, Purbright thought, quickening as the second shock rippled through its veins. Somewhere amid the smoke and whispers, the hand that had struck once was preparing to strike again. Evening settled over Flaxborough with a damp heaviness, the kind of chill that crept beneath doors and into bones. The market square was nearly empty now, its earlier chaos reduced to the occasional rattle of shutters being drawn and the lonely clop of a cart horse making its final journey home. From his office window, Inspector Purbright watched the mist thicken in the street lamp's glow, softening the edges of buildings until the town looked like a faded photograph. He turned away and moved to his desk. The room smelled faintly of smoke carried in on his coat, mingled with the dusty tang of old case files and the sharper note of freshly sharpened pencils. Papers lay in careful stacks, though none were as orderly as his outward manner suggested. Purbright sank into his chair and folded his hands, staring at nothing for several long moments. The day's events replayed themselves in fragments. The blackened ruin of the goods shed, Daggett's blustering demands, the crowd's angry murmur rising like the sea before a storm. Beneath it all lay a pattern that felt, to Purbright, both familiar and deeply troubling. Flaxborough prided itself on being a respectable town. Its inhabitants cherished routine, propriety, and the small rituals of daily life. They were not, as a rule, violent people, but they were capable, profoundly capable of cruelty of another sort, a cruelty born not of passion, but of preservation. Reputation was the true currency here, more valuable than coin or property. A good name could open doors, secure favorable terms, even excuse minor sins. Conversely, a single stain, once visible, could never be fully scrubbed away. People would go to remarkable lengths to prevent such stains from spreading to their own households. Purbright leaned back, eyes half-lidded. He had seen it before, a businessman willing to perjure himself rather than admit insolvency, a churchwarden prepared to ruin a neighbour's livelihood to hide his daughter's scandal. Such acts were rarely dramatic. They were carried out politely, almost invisibly, under the cover of shared understanding. The body by the railway embankment was no stranger, he was now certain of that. The townsfolk's loud denials and perfect ignorance rang too hollow. Someone, perhaps several someones, knew exactly who the dead man was, and their silence was not born of fear alone. It was something colder, calculation. His gaze drifted to the notebook lying closed on his desk. Inside it rested two items, the damp bus ticket and the charred scrap of cloth he had found near the goods shed window. Small things, almost laughably insignificant to an outsider. Yet, to Purbright, they were like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle whose full image remained obscured. The ticket spoke of movement, of a journey that contradicted the tidy narrative laid before him. If the deceased had arrived on that late bus, why had the driver claimed ignorance? Why had Fenwick, the station master, been so emphatic that no unfamiliar face had crossed his platform? The scrap of cloth suggested a second, more deliberate action. The fire had not been mere mischief or drunken carelessness. It had been purposeful, targeted. Someone had wanted to erase the past, to destroy the fragile paper trail that might have given the dead man a name. Purbright considered the two acts together. First, a man was carefully placed where he would be found, posed almost theatrically, his shoes unsoiled, his body straight. Then, days later, the records that might have explained his presence were reduced to ash. One act of presentation, one of obliteration. He toyed with the idea of a single culprit, but his instincts rebelled. This felt more like a collaboration, each participant ignorant of the other's full intent. Crossed wires, crossed purposes. In Flaxborough, such things often arose not from conspiracy, but from overlapping desires. The feud between Daggett and Bristow returned to his mind. Their public shouting match had been entertaining for the crowd, but beneath the theatre lay a genuine bitterness. Daggett craved influence and applause. Bristow prized control of information. Either man might have used the body, the fire, or both to strike at the other indirectly. Then there was Mrs. Hartleby's trembling confession. A voice in the night, perhaps belonging to Councillor Sims. If she was correct, it placed a prominent figure near the scene before the discovery.
Why had she been so terrified to speak?
Fear of reprisal or of implicating herself by association? Purbright's fingers drummed lightly on the desktop. The theory forming in his mind was delicate, like a spider's web stretched across an open doorway. Too much weight, and it would collapse. Suppose, he thought, the dead man had been living a double life. One identity known to a select few in Flaxborough, the other entirely hidden. Suppose he had dealings with both respectable citizens and less reputable elements, straddling the line between public decency and private scandal. His sudden death would place those dealings at risk of exposure. For some, the solution would be to conceal his very existence. A silent agreement, deny recognition, destroy records, and let the stranger remain a stranger forever. For others, however, the temptation might be to exploit the situation, to shift blame, to settle scores, to draw suspicion toward rivals. Thus, a body carefully displayed, a fire deliberately lit, a witness too eager, a widow too frightened, each act part of a larger mosaic, though the picture itself remained hidden. Purbright allowed himself a small, humourless smile. The irony of it struck him. In their frantic efforts to maintain appearances, the townsfolk had created a tangle far more conspicuous than the scandal they feared. In trying to preserve Flaxborough's dignity, they had set it on fire, figuratively and literally. He rose and crossed to the window again. Outside, the mist had thickened into a fine drizzle. Street lamps cast pale halos of light, blurred and indistinct. Somewhere out there, people were whispering in kitchens and parlours, making plans, rehearsing lies. He could almost hear the low hum of their voices beneath the rain. The inspector's expression smoothed into its usual blandness. Mallet would soon return with updates, and Purbright would listen, nod, and ask questions that seemed harmless. He would give nothing away. For now the theory must remain his alone. It was not yet ready to bear the weight of accusation. Like a seed planted in the dark, it required silence to grow. He turned back to his desk, extinguished the lamp, and stood for a moment in the shadows. In Flaxborough, truth was never a single shining revelation. It was a collection of fragments, gathered quietly, pieced together with patience. And when at last it took shape, it did so not with a shout, but with a whisper, soft, inevitable, and devastating. Purbright closed the door behind him, leaving the room in darkness while the drizzle outside continued its quiet, ceaseless fall. The following afternoon dawned grey, but mercifully dry, the drizzle of the previous night having exhausted itself. By mid-morning, word had spread that Inspector Purbright was to give a brief address at the Town Hall regarding public safety in relation to railway operations. It was a phrase sufficiently bland to invite neither excitement nor alarm, which was precisely why it attracted so many. Flaxborough's citizens were not ones to miss a gathering where they might observe their neighbours and speculate about what was not being said. By the appointed hour, the hall was well filled. Councillor Daggett presided at the front, radiating self-importance as though the assembly were his own idea. Beside him sat Councillor Sims, tall and skeletal, with a perpetual air of injured dignity. Near the middle rows, Mrs. Gillingworth perched primly between two other matrons, her hat bristling like an armed hedgehog. Mr. Bristow, the bookshop owner, sat a few seats away, his face composed into an expression of faint, ironic amusement. Even Mrs. Hartleby, pale and anxious, had been coaxed into attendance by a neighbour who insisted the meeting was about nothing controversial. Purbright took his place at the lectern with his customary mildness. He gave no sign that this gathering was anything other than a matter of routine. Mallet, stationed discreetly near the rear, studied the crowd with a watchful eye. "Good afternoon," Purbright began, his voice calm and deliberate. "Thank you all for coming. Recent events have understandably caused some concern regarding the safety and reliability of our railway facilities. It seemed prudent to provide information and to hear your thoughts." He proceeded to speak for several minutes in a tone so measured that it seemed almost soporific. He discussed fire safety protocols, the importance of accurate record-keeping, and the necessity of vigilance when transporting goods. The words flowed smoothly, their very dullness lulling his audience into a state of relaxed attention. A few heads nodded in agreement, while others merely nodded in drowsiness. Then, at a carefully chosen moment, Purbright allowed his gaze to sweep the room. "There is, however," he said mildly, "one aspect I must emphasize. In our review of the goods shed fire, it became clear that certain documents were deliberately removed before the blaze began." A subtle ripple passed through the crowd like a breeze stirring long grass. Most faces showed only polite surprise, but one face, a particular face, tightened almost imperceptibly. It was not a large movement, barely more than a flicker, yet Purbright's eyes missed nothing. He continued as though he had observed nothing at all. "The missing documents relate to passenger activity during the previous week."
Naturally, this raises questions.
"But I must assure you that these questions will be answered in due course." At this, Mr. Bristow shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers resting on the back of the chair before him. Across the aisle, Councillor Sims adjusted his cuff in a movement so precise it seemed rehearsed. Purbright pressed on, describing in placid detail the railway company's plans for improved oversight. As he spoke, he introduced a subtle thread into his remarks, something unrelated on the surface, yet designed to tug at hidden nerves. "It is worth noting," he said, his tone conversational, "that certain tickets sold in the past fortnight were purchased not by the travellers themselves, but by others acting on their behalf. In most cases, this was perfectly innocent, a husband collecting a ticket for his wife, for instance. Yet in one instance, the purchaser used an alias. Quite an unusual step in a town like ours." A murmur ran through the hall. Several people turned to their neighbours in surprise. Mrs. Gillingworth whispered to Mrs. Copplestone, who nearly dropped her handbag in excitement. At the far side of the room, Mrs. Hartleby clutched her handkerchief so tightly that it tore slightly at the edge. Purbright's eyes moved past her, unhurried, and came to rest on Councillor Sims. The man's tall frame had stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Of course," Purbright continued, seemingly oblivious to the ripple he had caused, "it is possible that this alias was a simple clerical error. Nevertheless, I find such errors worthy of examination. They can lead to misunderstandings or worse, to misplaced blame." Here he allowed the faintest pause, just long enough for unease, to take root. "Indeed," he added softly, "one might even imagine a situation where a person wished to conceal not only another's journey, but the very fact of their connection." The hall had grown very quiet. Even Daggett's habitual bluster was momentarily stilled. Sims's hand, resting on the table before him, curled slightly into a fist. A sheen of perspiration glimmered at his temple. It was a small reaction, but to Purbright it was as clear as a confession. The inspector allowed a few more sentences of routine commentary to follow, giving his quarry time to regain composure. Then he concluded with a bland expression of gratitude.
"I trust this discussion has been helpful."
"Should anyone have additional concerns, please speak with me privately afterward. Good day to you all." As the audience rose, buzzing with speculation, Mallet pushed his way to Purbright's side. "Well, sir," he murmured, "that was a fine speech about very little. Though I noticed old Sims looked ready to choke on his own tongue halfway through. Did he?" Purbright asked mildly, as though the matter barely interested him. "He did," Mallet insisted. "And Bristow too, though for different reasons, I reckon. What exactly were you hinting at, sir?" Purbright gave a small, enigmatic smile. "Merely that facts have a curious way of surfacing, Sergeant. Sometimes all one need do is stir the water gently. They moved through the dispersing crowd. Near the door, Mrs. Hartleby caught Purbright's sleeve. Her face was pale, her voice trembling. "Inspector, I must speak with you alone." "Certainly," Purbright said soothingly, "but perhaps not here." He guided her a few steps aside, ensuring their conversation could not be overheard. "I can't bear it any longer," she whispered.
"I know something about that poor man, the one they found."
"It isn't much, but if I don't tell you, I'll never sleep again." Purbright's gaze softened, though his voice remained calm. "Then you shall tell me, Mrs. Hartleby, but for now take a deep breath."
"Appearances must be maintained." As he led her toward the exit, he caught a glimpse of Sims standing very still near the front row, watching them with a fixed, unnatural smile.
That smile alone confirmed what Purbright had already suspected. The gentle stirring of the water had unsettled more than one fish in this particular pond. Outside, the evening air was sharp and cool. Lantern light spilled onto the cobblestones, illuminating small groups of townsfolk as they clustered to exchange theories. From their animated chatter, one might have thought the meeting had been about anything but railway safety. Mallet muttered under his breath, "The whole place is in a lather again, sir." Purbright, guiding Mrs. Hartleby toward a waiting carriage, replied softly, "Excellent, Sergeant. Confusion is the natural habitat of truth. When people are no longer certain of their footing, they tend to reveal where they have been treading." He glanced back once at the hall, where Sims remained framed in the doorway, still and watchful. The trap had been set with the lightest of touches, and now Purbright need only wait to see who struggled hardest to free themselves. The drawing-room of the vicarage was warm, the fire crackling in the grate and the heavy curtains drawn against the damp evening. It was a setting chosen deliberately by Purbright for its air of calm domesticity. The mood was almost cozy, at odds with the gravity of the gathering. A tea tray rested on a low table, though no one had touched it. The cups sat cooling, their contents untouched, while tension filled the air like a storm waiting to break. Present were Councillor Daggett, looking irritable and defensive, Mr. Bristow, who had adopted his usual air of detached superiority, Mrs. Hartleby pale and trembling, and Councillor Sims, whose gaunt face was fixed in an expression of strained politeness. Sergeant Mallet stood discreetly by the door, silent but alert. Purbright occupied an armchair near the hearth, his hands folded loosely in his lap. When he spoke, it was in the same calm, deliberate tone he might have used to explain a parish dispute over hymn numbers. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his gaze sweeping the room without accusation. "We have, between us, endured a most unsettling series of events, a body discovered, a fire at the goods shed, and an ever-thickening cloud of rumour. It is time, I think, to draw the threads together and see what pattern they form." Daggett harumphed. "About time, too. The town's been in an uproar. We need a clear statement, Inspector, so this nonsense can be put behind us." "Quite so," Purbright agreed mildly. "And clarity, like a good window, must be carefully cleaned before the view can be trusted. Let us begin with the identity of the deceased."
Much has been made of the fact that no one seemed to recognize him.
Yet I suggest that many of you did recognize him, only too well. A ripple of discomfort passed through the group. Bristow's fingers tightened minutely on the arm of his chair. Sims's pale throat moved as he swallowed. Purbright continued, his voice steady. "The man we found by the railway embankment was not a stranger.
His name was Henry Klein, though most of you knew him by another, his public face, so to speak."
Klein led a double life. By day, he was a quiet, respectable clerk in the employ of the railway company, diligent and unremarkable. By night, he became something rather different. Mrs. Hartleby let out a small gasp, pressing her handkerchief to her lips. Klein, Purbright went on, was engaged in financial dealings of a dubious nature. He exploited his position to manipulate records, skimming funds and arranging false shipments. To maintain this deception, He cultivated separate identities, one for his official duties, one for his clandestine activities, a careful balancing act until recently. Bristow's voice was smooth, though edged with disdain. If this is true, Inspector, why did no one simply expose him? Because exposure, Purbright said softly, would have spread scandal far beyond Mr. Klein himself. Several individuals, perhaps even some in this room, had dealings with him, innocently at first, perhaps, then less so. When he died, they were faced with a choice. Admit what they knew and risk their own reputations, or remain silent. Sims shifted in his chair, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrest. Consider the scene at the embankment, Purbright continued. Klein's body was placed with great care, shoes spotless, clothing immaculate. This was not a murder in the heat of passion, but a presentation.
A statement.
The message was simple. This man was nobody.
He'd never truly lived here.
It was meant to erase him, to make him appear a stranger so no questions would be asked. Mrs. Hartleby spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I heard voices that night, arguing. One of them sounded like Councillor Sims. I thought perhaps it was my imagination. All eyes turned to Sims. His expression froze.
This is outrageous, he said hoarsely.
You have no proof, only the frightened ramblings of a lonely woman. Purbright inclined his head politely. Indeed, Reverend Pelham's garden can be draughty at night, which does strange things to sound. But in this case, Mrs. Hartleby's recollection is supported by another piece of evidence. He reached into his notebook and withdrew the bus ticket, carefully flattened between two sheets of paper. This was found near the hedge by the railway. It shows that someone, likely Klein himself, arrived on the late bus. Yet our witnesses, including the driver, denied seeing him.
An inconvenient truth, easily smothered by collective silence. Bristow's smooth facade cracked for a fraction of a second.
Daggett glanced between them, confused and uneasy. Purbright set the ticket down gently. But even silence cannot erase every trace. When the goods shed burned, I examined the site closely. Among the ashes I discovered a fragment of cloth. He produced the charred remnant. This matched a ledger cover known to have contained records of Klein's fraudulent shipments. The fire was no accident. It was set deliberately to destroy evidence. Sims surged to his feet.
You dare accuse me of arson? This is preposterous.
No, Councillor, Purbright said evenly.
I accuse you of desperation.
You feared that Klein's records would implicate you, not in theft, perhaps, but in complicity. You signed off on shipments you did not fully understand, perhaps in exchange for favours. When Klein died, you saw your chance to erase those mistakes. Sims's mouth opened, then closed. His face was the colour of ash. Mrs. Hartleby wept quietly into her handkerchief. Bristow, watching Sims with a predator's stillness, gave no sign of relief or guilt. Purbright's gaze moved to him.
As for you, Mr. Bristow, your role was more subtle.
You knew of Klein's second life, but you did not speak because it suited you to have him in your debt. When he died, you encouraged the illusion that he was a stranger, thereby preserving your own influence. Bristow's lips curved in a humourless smile. Influence, Inspector, is a slippery word.
One might equally say prudence. Quite so, Purbright replied, unperturbed.
And prudence often resembles cowardice. Daggett, who had been following the exchange with mounting bewilderment, finally burst out, so all this fuss, the body, the fire,
the endless speculation, it was all just...
Bookkeeping gone wrong? Purbright allowed himself a small smile. Bookkeeping, Councillor, can be more perilous than pistol shots when reputations are at stake. In this case, Klein's double life was the thread that, once pulled, threatened to unravel several well-pressed garments. He rose, his tone still gentle, but carrying unmistakable authority. The law will determine the precise penalties, but let us at least dispense with the fiction of ignorance. Henry Klein was no outsider. He was one of you, and you all helped, through action or inaction, to shape the tale of a stranger's corpse. For a moment, there was only the crackle of the fire and Mrs. Hartleby's quiet sobs. Then Sims sank back into his chair, defeated. Bristow stared into the middle distance, already calculating how best to salvage his position. Purbright reached for his hat. "Sergeant Mallet will take your statements presently. I thank you for your candour, belated though it may be." As he and Mallet left the vicarage, the inspector glanced up at the misty night. "Truth," he murmured, "is rarely hidden."
It sits in plain sight, waiting for people to stop looking past it. Mallet gave a low whistle. "You've a way of seeing through folks, sir." Purbright's expression was unreadable. "Not through them, Sergeant."
Merely around the corners they would prefer to keep dark. The morning after Purbright's quiet revelation at the vicarage dawned pale and mild, a thin veil of mist hovering over the rooftops like breath held too long. By mid-morning the town's heartbeat had resumed its usual rhythm. Shop shutters rattled open, milk carts clinked their way down narrow streets, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the bakery into the market square. Outwardly nothing had changed. Inwardly everything had shifted by a fraction, so subtly that only the most attentive might have noticed. At the Grapes Inn, conversations swirled around tankards of bitter. Men, who the previous week had been experts on railway timetables, were now specialists in morality and motive. "I always said there was something odd about that goods clerk," declared Mr. Digby, the ironmonger, wagging a finger for emphasis. "Quiet ones are the worst. Never trust a man who polishes his shoes too often." His drinking companion, a retired schoolteacher named Carlo, sniffed.
"Nonsense.
Shoes are neither here nor there. The real mystery is how many others knew and kept silent. That's the scandal, mark my words." From the far end of the bar, a farmer named Blagg added darkly, "Sims knew. You can see it in his face. And what about that bookseller, Bristow?"
"Too smooth by half."
"He's got a finger in every pie." The landlord, tired of the endless theories, interrupted to pour another round.
"Finger in a pie or not, they've got to live here same as the rest of us."
Let the inspector sort it out and leave the poor pies alone. This advice was ignored. By noon, the discussion had evolved into a complex game of speculation, each participant vying to reveal some supposed insider knowledge. By evening, no one could quite recall which parts had been fact and which had been invented. In the post office, Mrs. Gillingworth presided like a general at headquarters. "What truly astonishes me," she told a cluster of wide-eyed listeners, "is how close we all came to being deceived. Why, only last month I sold Mr. Klein, though of course he gave another name, a set of postal orders. Very polite, very proper. Not a hint of deceit."
"I might have helped him without knowing it."
Her audience gasped appropriately, though one of them muttered that Mrs. Gillingworth's hindsight was rather better than her foresight. Meanwhile, Councillor Daggett attempted to present himself as a steadying force amid the turmoil. He convened a hastily arranged meeting in the council chamber, his voice booming as he declared that the matter was regrettable but now resolved. His speech contained numerous references to civics,
unity and moving forward, but curiously
omitted any mention of Sims or the railway company's role. When questioned afterward by a local reporter, Daggett's answers were masterfully vague. "Lessons will be learned," he said, puffing out his chest, "and safeguards will be implemented." Exactly what those lessons or safeguards might be was left entirely unspecified. Sims, on the other hand, was notably absent from public view. His usual routines, morning walks, midday appearances at the coffee house, were abandoned. Curtains at his house remained drawn, and his servants, when questioned, offered only tight-lipped statements about his ill health. The absence was conspicuous enough to fuel further gossip. Some claimed he had fled the town altogether. Others insisted he was merely biding his time, waiting for tempers to cool. Bristow, in contrast, maintained his usual presence but with a subtle shift in manner. His smiles were thinner now, his sarcasm sharper. Those who frequented his bookshop noticed a new display of detective novels in the window, each title chosen with what seemed like sly intent. The Hidden Face, Smoke and Mirrors, The Quiet Witness. Whether this was coincidence or provocation, no one could say. Mrs. Hartleby, relieved of her burden, ventured out more frequently. Neighbours remarked on her improved complexion and whispered that perhaps she would soon take up charitable work again. She, however, avoided certain streets and doorways with the precision of a map-maker, as though invisible boundaries now divided the town into safe and unsafe territories. For the railway company, the aftermath was practical rather than emotional. A temporary goods shed was erected with remarkable speed, overseen by men who spoke little and worked quickly. Their presence was briskly efficient, their departure even more so, leaving behind no trace of conversation or opinion. The ledger system was revised, new locks were fitted, and signs proclaiming authorized personnel only appeared as if by magic. The townsfolk interpreted these changes in various ways. Some saw them as evidence of reform, others as proof of a continuing cover-up. Either way, the improvements were soon accepted as part of the landscape, like the arrival of a new lamp-post or the disappearance of an old one. Through all this, Purbright moved quietly, his role now more observer than participant. He visited the council offices, the station, and the market square with the same mild expression, offering polite greetings but no revelations. When asked about the case, he merely said that statements had been taken and reports prepared. His tone implied that the matter was safely in the hands of bureaucracy, where it would moulder undisturbed. At the police station, his office returned to its usual state of subdued clutter. The bus ticket lay filed away in a folder marked simply miscellaneous. The charred scrap of cloth rested in an envelope beside it. Neither item seemed remarkable now, yet both had been essential threads in unravelling the tapestry of lies. Mallet, though outwardly relieved, struggled with the lingering unease that came from unfinished business. "Funny thing, sir," he remarked one afternoon as he stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "We've got the truth, more or less, and still it doesn't feel like justice. Sims isn't behind bars, Bristow's still selling books, and the townsfolk are back to their gossip as if nothing happened." Purbright looked up from his paperwork with a faint smile. "Justice, Sergeant, is a relative term. In Flaxborough it is often measured not by punishment but by balance restored. The scales may never be perfectly level, but they are no longer tipping dangerously." Mallet frowned. "Seems a bit unsatisfying." "It usually is," Purbright said gently. "But consider this. Those who lied to protect themselves will spend the rest of their days wondering when the truth might surface again. That, in its way, is a sentence of sorts." Mallet considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "I suppose so, sir. Still, I'd rather see a proper trial." Purbright returned to his papers, making a small notation in neat, precise handwriting. "Trials are public spectacles, Sergeant. Sometimes the quiet consequence is more effective." Outside, life flowed on. The market square bustled with shoppers haggling over cabbages and bolts of cloth. Children chased each other around the fountain, their laughter echoing against the stone buildings. Even the railway yard seemed peaceful, its new structures gleaming faintly in the weak sunlight. Yet beneath the surface, subtle changes were evident to those who knew where to look. Bristow's clientele shifted slightly, certain patrons no longer crossing his threshold. Daggett's speeches were met with polite applause rather than fervent enthusiasm. Mrs. Hartleby's path through town traced a careful dance around unseen dangers. Most telling of all was the way. Conversations paused when certain names were mentioned. Laughter faltered, voices dropped, and eyes flicked toward doorways to ensure privacy. In a town where reputation was everything, silence could be as revealing as speech. Late one evening, as Purbright worked alone in his office, he paused to reflect on this quiet transformation. The case was closed, yet its echoes would linger for years. The balance of power had shifted. not dramatically but perceptibly. A man had died, and in his death he had rearranged the invisible threads that bound Flaxborough together. Purbright's pen scratched steadily across the final page of his report. When he finished, he blotted the ink, closed the folder, and placed it neatly on a stack of others. There was no flourish, no outward sign of satisfaction. He rose, adjusted his hat, and extinguished the lamp. The office fell into shadow, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps outside. As he locked the door, he allowed himself a brief moment of contemplation. The town would continue as it always had, gossiping, scheming, pretending. But now, somewhere beneath the surface, a new awareness would persist, a reminder that even the most carefully maintained facade could crack. The next morning, Flaxborough awoke to another ordinary day. Bread was bought, letters were posted, and the market square filled once more with chatter. To a stranger passing through, it would have seemed a picture of tranquil routine. Only those who lived there knew that beneath the calm lay secrets too delicate to name. In the station yard, a train whistle blew, long and low, before fading into the distance. Purbright, seated at his desk with a fresh stack of paperwork, listened to the sound without expression. Then he picked up his pen and began to write, as though nothing at all had happened. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.